This is section 6. This is the very last section of your notes. And this is going to cover the other kingdoms that we haven't talked about yet, as well as some infectious diseases. So an infectious disease is one that spreads from person to person, and it's often caused by something called a pathogen. A pathogen is a living thing, or a virus, which is not living, and that would cause your disease. So in the case of bacteria, that would be like strep throat, caused by the Streptococcus bacteria. If it's a fungus, it could be ringworm. The protozoas, like we talked about, are protists, and that would be like malaria. And then viruses would be like the common cold, herpes, cold sores, things like that. So any of those are pathogens. How do they spread from person to person? Well, lots of different ways. The first way would be through food. This is usually how food poisoning is spread. So somebody eats something that has been contaminated and then they get super sick. It can also sometimes be spread through the air. That's how the common cold spreads. So somebody sneezes or coughs and the particles get on somebody else and get them sick. It can also be spread through water, as is giardiasis. And so again, somebody drinks that contaminated water and then they get super sick. It can also be left on surfaces. So things like athlete's foot, that's kind of how that spreads from one person to another. Direct contact would be like mono, also known as a kissing disease. So you have to literally kind of swap body fluids with another person to get that one. And then the last way would be through a vector, and that's like malaria. So a vector is an organism that's going to carry that pathogen for us. So in the case of malaria, it uses a mosquito to carry that. So then we said viruses are not living. So then what is it? Well, basically it doesn't fit under any kingdom. It's very unique, and because it's not living, we can't really kill it, which makes them very tricky to get rid of once they get into the body. So they look like a couple different ways. Here's just a couple pictures on the bottom. It's usually DNA or RNA, that's their genetic material, surrounded by what we call a protein coat. And the protein coat and the capsule are going to kind of keep it nice and protected so it can live in pretty extreme environments and still survive. And their whole purpose in life is to find something that is living and then use it and trick it into making its own DNA. So it'll help, kind of basically bust into the cell, take over, and then trick it into making the viral DNA. So it has surface proteins. Those are these little things sticking off the sides of it, and that's going to help mark and identify it as a virus and tell us what type of virus it is. Underneath that, or on the very outside here, is the lipid envelope. So it's made of fat, and it's kind of an outer protective layer, and it's going to keep it nice and safe in a lot of different environments, even if it's not in a living organism. And then under that, in some viruses, there's a thing called a capsid. And this is basically just an extra layer of protection. It's basically like a protein shell. Inside, then, we have the genetic material, which is DNA or RNA. And then we also have some enzymes, and those are going to help the virus reproduce once it gets into a living cell. So some examples of viruses. First would be the herpes virus. What it does is it basically gets inside into the cell's DNA, and then it can kind of sit there dormant for a while. And then all of a sudden, when the body gets pretty weak, like super stressed out, or the body is already kind of sick, then all of a sudden the herpes DNA kind of kicks in, and the virus starts to take over. And then that's usually when the person starts getting some symptoms of it and kind of starts getting sick. So one of the best symptoms for the herpes virus particularly are cold sores popping up around the mouth. So it starts leaving these open, kind of sore blisters around that nice soft tissue around the mouth. Another example of a virus is the influenza, which is the common cold. So it's RNA surrounded by a phospholipid membrane, and they're going to use their enzymes then to help reproduce this virus. So the virus gets in, starts replicating its DNA, and then it basically pops the cell that it's inside, kind of destroying that cell membrane, and that's how it leaves. And then it'll move on to the next cell and do the same thing. So it's kind of destroying the good healthy cells and in place leaving the viral cells. So symptoms, headache, which is pretty minor. Obviously people who get the cold, get really tired and weak, lots of mucus, runny nose, sore throat, all those kinds of things. And the hard part about the influenza virus is that It's a tricky little sucker. It actually mutates almost every year, which is why we have to switch up our vaccines every year and you have to get a new one every year. It's kind of a guessing game of what is it going to do and how is it going to mutate. Another virus is called HIV, and that is an acronym for the human immunodeficiency virus. And what this does is it basically uses your white blood cells to reproduce itself. So we call this a retrovirus. It's going to use RNA, which then makes DNA, and that DNA goes into your white blood cells then in the nucleus. And then again, once I said, or like I said on the last one, as soon as you kind of get into a weakened state, then that virus kicks in and starts making a whole bunch of itself and basically taking out your immune system. So it makes the person really weak and kind of sick. So again, it can sit dormant for years until that body's weak enough and really wants to kick in. And then eventually the white blood cell count gets so low that the person is very vulnerable to just other things like the common cold or something as simple as pneumonia or something like diarrhea, and all of a sudden they're getting just something that should be easy to fight off and their body just cannot fight it because they don't have enough white blood cells. So when it hits that point, we call it AIDS, which stands for acquired immunodeficiency syndrome. So it was an immunodeficiency virus that started it all, and now we've turned it into a syndrome. And usually once it hits the AIDS point, once you've been diagnosed with AIDS, the person doesn't seem to have too long of a lifespan after that. So you can live with the virus in your body for a while, but the AIDS usually will kind of wipe that person out. So we developed some vaccines to help fend off these viruses, and basically all it is a deactivated version of that pathogen. We put it into the body and hopefully then it'll trigger the immune system to start defending and building up some antibodies, so when the actual pathogen gets in, you're that much stronger and able to protect yourself against it. So lots of different vaccines exist. You have to get, a different shot for each type of thing you want to protect against. And in the case of like the influenza, every year we have to make a new vaccine, and that's why you have to get a flu shot every year. So, because they mutate really fast. First vaccine ever made was by Edward Jenner in the 1700s, and it was to protect against a disease called smallpox, which showed little red bumps and kind of rashes all over the skin, affected small children and really made them kind of sick. So lots of people have some pretty bad scars from smallpox. And so that was one of the diseases they were trying to fight off. So he actually kind of almost accidentally discovered that first vaccine. And then we already talked about a problem with vaccines is that if a virus mutates, that vaccine then becomes ineffective. So we have to keep changing vaccines to kind of keep up with those mutating viruses. What we call a symptom is a sign that somebody has a virus or is ill with it. And symptoms can be anything from a runny nose to a cough to a sore throat. So, or in the case of herpes, it'd be that cold sore. There is really no treatment if you have a viral infection. Nothing can kill a virus because it's not living. So what we can do is obviously vaccine would be the first step so that you can actually prevent yourself from getting sick in the first place. And then unfortunately, once you get sick, we can use what's called antiviral medicine. It's going to hopefully stop the RNA from spreading. Although again, we cannot destroy the virus. So you just kind of have to treat your symptoms and let it run its course and hope that it's not one of those viruses that's going to completely wipe you out. An epidemic is like a major outbreak of a certain type of disease. We monitor these in Atlanta, Georgia. It's a group called the CDC, Centers for Disease Control. And it's a whole bunch of scientists, and they pretty much watch worldwide and make sure that, no major diseases are spreading from country to country or in one region particularly. If they do see that an epidemic is occurring and they see major outbreaks happening, they will often quarantine a region. And what that means then is nobody can travel in and out of the area. If somebody is infected, they would put them in a whole separate containment area, and nobody'd be able to have direct contact with the infected person without special equipment being worn. And then in worst case scenarios, if it's a really bad sort of virus or disease, they would maybe even have to go in and burn some material possessions. So We recently, just this year, had an Ebola outbreak. So again, they every time you go to the doctor, they're like, have you been to these countries in the last, 30 some days? Well, they're checking to make sure that you're not a high risk for bringing back one of these diseases with you. And the people who did get Ebola were definitely quarantined and weren't allowed to see any uninfected people for over 20 some days. And they definitely had material possessions burned. So clothes that they were wearing and then things they directly touched immediately after getting infected. Another type of infectious agent is called a prion. Prions are just misfolded proteins, and when they get into the body, they actually cause all the other proteins of the body to misfold. So they get passed on, excuse me, through eating infected tissue. So if you have meat that's been infected and all of a sudden you eat the meat, you now have that prion in your body. So some examples of prions would be mad cow disease. This is where the nervous system starts to kind of shut down. An organism will have dementia, which is where the mind just starts losing control. And worst case scenario, you get some convulsions where the body will start shaking and the muscles are twitching uncontrollably. So this gets passed usually through the meat of cows onto other organisms who eat the cows. So, you get a wild wolf who takes out a cow and eats it, and all of a sudden now they've contacted this prion disease. In humans, we call it Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. It's basically mad cow, only it just changes its name. It causes hallucinations, convulsions, motor function loss, meaning you don't have control over your muscles. Again, you're shaking. This is always fatal when it gets into a human. And again, it's passed through eating infected meat. So you ate that prion in infected tissue. This is actually pretty common, Creutzfeldt-Jakob, among certain tribes who do practice cannibalism. So they like to, eat and consume human tissue. And if that human tissue has been infected of some sort, then they themselves get the disease. So kind of a rough one. And like we said, it's always fatal. So not good. All right. And that is the end of your notes.